Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry to interrupt your breakfast, but this is a working meeting. The faculty of the schools of mathematics and natural sciences thought that you should hear about some of the fascinating work going on in other schools at the Institute. So this morning we're privileged to have Didier Fassin, who is the James D. Wolfensohn Professor in our School of Social Science, talk to us about conspiracy theories in medicine. Didier's research is focused at the intersection of the theoretical and ethnographic foundations of anthropology. Originally trained as a physician, he's conducted field studies in Senegal, Ecuador, South Africa, and France that have led to perspectives that have illuminated important aspects of maternal health, social disparities in health, and the AIDS epidemic. Didier took his doctorate in medicine in 1982, his master's degree in public health in 1986, and his PhD in social science in 1988, all in Paris. Before joining the faculty of the Institute last year, Didier was, amongst other things, professor of sociology at the University of Paris North, and from 2007 he was the founding director of IRIS, the Interdisciplinary Research Institute on Social Issues in Paris. Amongst many other responsibilities, Didier was vice president of the French National Committee on AIDS from 2004 to 2006, and vice president of Médecins Sans Frontières from 1999 to 2003. Didier.
Thank you, Peter. It is a pleasure and an honor to have been invited by my colleagues from the School of Mathematics and School of Natural Science to represent, so to speak, the two other schools, Historical Studies and Social Science, in this event. As soon as I had accepted their invitation, however, I started to wonder what could be the subject of my talk. I was actually caught between two concerns. I wanted to arouse the interest of hard scientists as opposed to the soft scientists we are supposed to be, or should I say in humanities as opposed to humanities, to quote a French friend, astrophysicist, who was also the national director of research in France. And I hoped I could avoid breakfast indigestion for the rest of the audience. I decided in favor of the first option, hoping that the evocation of conspiracy theories, which pose interesting anthropological and epistemological questions, would not be too heavy on your stomach this early in the morning. On the 15th of September 2000, the headline of the South African weekly Mail and Guardian ran, "AIDS tragedy turns to farce." The paper was referring to an odd episode that had taken place a few days before on a renowned radio talk show. As he was interviewing the Minister of Health, Manto Chabalam-Simang, star journalist John Robbie had mentioned a book that she was said to have distributed among the provincial health minister during a national meeting on the epidemic. Published in 1991, Behold a Pale Horse is a bestseller in the United States by Milton William Cooper, a former US Navy intelligence service agent, who revealed supposed plots that involved the Freemasons, the Illuminati, and space aliens, and included the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, supposedly organized by secret societies, and the preparation of mass killings carried out via the control of people's mind by Prozac. One of the conspiracies in his book concerned, quote, the extermination of undesirable elements of society, specifically the Black, Hispanic, and homosexual populations, unquote, through the dissemination of HIV using the smallpox vaccine in Africa during the 1970s. That a high-level government official could be receptive to this sort of literature and attempt to proselytize her colleagues at the moment when she was supposed to develop a program to halt the progression of the disease was certainly shocking to many. The country had recently discovered the gravity of the epidemic with 1/5 of its adult population infected and an estimated decrease in life expectancy by 20 years within the next 2 decades. And the President, Thabo Mbeki, had recently provoked indignation around the world by giving credit to heterodox thesis inspired by Berkeley dissident scientist Peter Duesberg, which asserted that poverty, rather than a virus, was the cause of the African AIDS, and that antiretroviral drugs were killing people instead of healing them as part of a possible plot against African populations. Manto Tshabalalam Simang affinities, not only with heterodox science, but also with conspiracy theories, were the straw that broke the camel's back. The revelation of these affinities infuriated some and amused others. The minister became simultaneously the most hated politician and the laughingstock of the South African white liberal elite. The Weekly Mail and Guardian, in reference to Alan Bennett's play about King George III, reported on, quote, the madness of Queen Manto. However, the issue was broader, as large segments of the black population of the townships and former homelands, as well as of the educated middle class, were sensitive, if not to the UFO plot, at least to the idea that a hidden truth about the epidemic existed. The AIDS tragedy was turning less to a farce than to drama. Conspiracy theories have a long history, but they still belong to our present. Contrarily to what positivism would predict, the increasing authority of science over our knowledge has not dispelled these theories, just as the expanding empire of rationality on our minds has not disenchanted our world and eliminated religion. Beliefs in improbable plots are permanently reinvented. We all remember that Princess Diana's death in a car accident in Paris has been attributed to the British Secret Service acting to prevent her engagement to Egyptian millionaire Dodi Fayed, and that the 9/11 attacks were alternatively blamed on the US military-industrial complex attempt to impose a military regime in the United States and on the US intelligence services need to justify wars against Iraq and Afghanistan. These allegations often find surprising echoes in the media and public opinion, but also sometimes among intellectuals and politicians. Of course, they also provoke antagonist reactions, which are usually of two kinds, as we've seen: indignation or mockery. Typically, conspiratorial statements are object of either scandal or sarcasm. In the case I studied in South Africa in the early 2000s, the madness of Queen Manto and the so-called folly of King Thabo aroused both anger and derision among activists, physicians, and scientists. Contrarily to these common attitudes, I take these heterodoxy seriously. Not that I credit them with a scientific or factual truth, but because they denote a distinct historical and political truth. Actually, I even made them the center of my research on AIDS in South Africa. To dismiss these conspiratorial narratives as criminal or ridiculous, as the product of cynical minds trying to seduce their constituency, or as the result of the pathological symptoms of deranged decision makers, cannot account for the broad audience these theories have, especially among black South African, or for the historical resonance they imply in the country of apartheid. In fact, this may not be even a uniquely South African story. A 2005 survey conducted by among African Americans by the Rand Corporation at Oregon State University indicated that nearly half believed HIV was man-made, 1/4 thought it had been produced in a government laboratory, and 1/8 considered that the CIA was involved. 15% of them in the United States viewed AIDS as a form of genocide against black people. The strangeness of secret society and space aliens, or of mysterious plots and complicated connivances, should certainly arouse more than condescending smiles or exasperated reactions. The need for anthropological inquiry on these issues does not emanate from the apparent exoticism of these beliefs, which in fact belong not to remote societies, but also to our world. We live in an age of anxiety, to quote Auden, in which conspiracy theories are widely distributed both spatially and socially, involving all sorts of individuals, from Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to Daniel Pipes, from Louis Farrakhan to Glenn Beck, crystallizing on all kinds of subjects, from the birth certificate of a president to the building of a mosque, from Islam to the Jews, and sometimes provoking uncontrollable reactions of violence or fear. Trying to make sense of what seems irrational and attempting to render the intelligibility of what appears at first sight to be incomprehensible represents therefore a crucial contribution of anthropology to our understanding of social worlds. But anthropologists, of course, do not have the monopoly here. And political scientist Richard Hofstadter wrote a famous piece in Harper's Magazine in 1964 entitled "The Paranoid Style in American Politics," in which he analyzed the genealogy of McCarthyism in the United States. Antecedents of targets of accusations are not lacking, from Illuminism and Masonry in the 18th century, to the Jesuits and Catholic in the 19th century, to the communists and the establishment in the 20th century. The adjective used by this author, paranoid, is interesting. If, from a psychiatric perspective, paranoia can be diagnosed in a patient as the combination of persecution, the idea of being the victim of a plot, and megalomania, the sense of one's greatness, the two features coalesce in all these conspiracy theories. Those who denounce them think there exists an invisible threat which endangers their collectivity or even the world, and they are the chosen ones who must unveil the concealed reality. By drawing this parallel between the psychic and the social, I'm not, however, suggesting a pathological model of society, but rather a structural analogy which may help us capture why certain conspiratorial configurations in the public sphere find potential echoes in the psychological functioning of apparently mentally sane individuals. In sum, why some people sometimes believe in apparently unbelievable plots. Of all conspiracy theories, which can be political, religious, military, etc., one category is of special interest and concern: the scientific theories, or maybe even more specifically the biomedical ones, by which I mean those both biological and medical. They are of special interest and concern not only because we are gathered here to celebrate the 80th anniversary of scientific institution, where these disciplines are represented, and because I'm speaking to mathematicians, physicists, and biologists, but because they address a specific truth, that of science, and a specific ethics, that of medicine. To believe, as some do, that science can be used for occult, malevolent purposes, and that medicine can fail its core principle of primum non nocere, touches the very heart of truth and ethics. They engage the idea of a cognitive deviance in science and of a moral perversion in medicine. But because the power exerted by science and medicine over bodies and lives, these conspiracy theories often assume a particularly tragic form, with the specter of the eradication of whole populations. As with all pandemic diseases, from 14th century plague to 19th century cholera, AIDS has provoked an epidemic of conspiracy theories. Not all of them are related to science and medicine. For instance, according to the scenario of the so-called AIDS Club narrative, which can be found in Indonesia, Egypt, Sweden, Canada, and the United States, A person gets infected, often through needle puncture or sexual relations, by an individual who disappears, leaving the message, "Welcome to the AIDS Club." Most of the time, however, the plots directly involve scientists and physicians. They may be local or global. Local theories correspond to specific situations. For instance, Libyan authorities, as you may remember, accused Bulgarian nurses and physicians to have voluntarily infected newborns in a hospital where they worked as expatriates. Global theories involve a broader frame. For example, after a biologist from Berlin invoked an experiment conducted at the military base of Fort Detrick, Maryland, and involving the injection of man-made virus to prison inmates, the accidental or intentional dissemination of the disease via vaccines became a leitmotif of most plots. The ideological background of the most prevalent AIDS conspiracy theories involves the planning of the genocide of Black or African population. It has been mobilized in different ways. Accusation of infecting populations, of denying them treatment, of using them as guinea pigs, of deliberately giving them toxic drugs. These accusations reverberate within the concerned population from Haiti to Kenya, from African Americans in the United States to Africans in South Africa, where the theme of extermination has become part of the common discourse. How can we account for these conspiracy theories about science and medicine? That is, not so much for their emergence as for their success. Why do so many people, including sometimes intellectuals and politicians, even scientists and physicians, adhere to paranoid worldviews which would normally be considered inconsistent and implausible, not to say absurd? The interpretations usually given fall into three main categories: psychological, cultural, and political. I do not know of any neuroscience of conspiracy yet, but I'm willing to take the bet that we will soon have functional brain imaging to localize the anatomical area where plots are conceived or adopted. And in fact, I recently read a call for such a neuroscience of conspiracy theory on a blog entitled Advanced Studies. But let us focus on more established interpretations. Psychological explanations refer either to individual characteristics such as paranoid personality, or more interestingly, to universal features like projective mechanism of one's personal hostility in some cases, or fear in others. Nevertheless, these interpretations either fall short, since even if we admit the insanity of a few promoters of plot imaginaries, they do not explain why large segments of the population adhere to the same theories. Or they seem almost truisms, since they almost paraphrase the definition of conspiratorial beliefs, which are of a projective nature. They can predict that individuals who experience the mental distortion of reality may extend them to their representations of the world, like British former journalist David Icke, known for his affirmation that reptilian humanoids are governing the world, or that many, under a totalitarian regime, may view the world with hostility and fear, as it was the case in the Soviet Union, or is still the case in Iran. But they are less useful to understand more ordinary situations. Cultural explanation propose more sophisticated perspectives. They discuss the saturation of our public sphere with unverifiable, or at least unverified, information in a context where there is simultaneously a permanent call for transparency in communication and an obvious opacity of certain institutions, including government, the army, and sometimes even science and medicine. The official statement by the French authorities that the Chernobyl nuclear cloud had miraculously stopped at the border of the country and therefore had no health consequences did not facilitate the building of trust in government and probably science, just as the reluctance of US military to investigate the Gulf War syndrome did little to contribute to confidence in the army and medicine. These interpretations, cultural ones, certainly set a context, but they do not account for the fact that some people are more prone than others to become involved in conspiracy theories. Political explanations are probably more relevant here. They suggest that historically dominated or discriminated groups, that is, people who subjectively consider that they have been or are still dominated or discriminated, are particularly prone to these conspiracy theories. When cholera started to spread in Venezuela and Ecuador several years ago, as I was working there, the Indian populations believed that it was part of a government plot and fled when medical teams arrived in their country, in their villages, excuse me. This narrative of the vanquished, in German historian Reinhard Koselleck's word, may reveal important historical but also epistemological truth. Until now, I have implicitly considered, as analysts of conspiracy theories usually do, that these theories were imaginary. Thus, we could draw a clear line between evidence-based and purely invented facts, between truth and error. We share, at least, suppose the vast majority of us, the idea that those who believe that HIV was accidentally or intentionally disseminated, or that AIDS was part of a plot to exterminate black population, are wrong. Even if we try to find explanations or sometimes even justifications regarding these misconceptions or delusions. But are we so sure that the limit can be so easily determined? Accidental side effects abound in African public health, the most documented, including by recent genetic studies, being the dramatic spread of hepatitis C as a result of mass campaigns of immunization in the colony in Cameroon, and of treatment against schistosomiasis after the 1960s in Egypt. Intentional malevolent actions appear to be much more rare, but the most studied is, as you know, the infamous Tuskegee experiment in the United States, which consisted of studying the natural evolution of syphilis among 400 African Americans from 1932 to 1972, denying them access to penicillin. Considering the publicity generated by these stories, it should be no surprise that the polio vaccine hypothesis to explain the origin of AIDS, initially proposed in the Lancet, had such a long life in spite of scientific evidence to the contrary, and that religious leaders in northern Nigeria may have spoken against polio vaccination that they found suspect of being mixed with sterilizing drugs, thus contributing to an epidemic of polio in the following years. The South African history dwells even deeper in this uncomfortable truth. Both science and medicine have been used there during almost a century to justify and implement domination over black South Africans, and the history of public health is closely related to the experience of racial oppression. The first measures of spatial segregation were taken during the 1900 bubonic plague epidemic in Cape Town, supposedly to protect the white population, despite the fact that African town dwellers were less infected. The same cynical use of disease for stigmatization and discrimination of African populations was later displayed with the Asian flu, tuberculosis, syphilis, and more dramatically, AIDS. During the final years of apartheid, that is in the 1990s, conservative and national parties representatives publicly rejoiced about the potential consequences of AIDS for the African population. AIDS will succeed where our policies have failed, some stated. That is, in turning black people into a minority. But in fact, extermination was not just a chimerical delirium of few far-right Afrikaners. It also became the goal of a secret operation named Project Coast, according to the last hearings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 1998. It gave rise to the opening of a new file for the 668 pages of the chemical and biological warfare hearings. A physician, Didier Fassin, commonly designated as Dr. Death, had developed with his colleagues a series of experiments with cholera and anthrax used against ANC leaders, along with a contraceptive supposedly aimed at the black population as part of an extermination program. More specifically, revelation that HIV-positive soldiers had been used to infect African prostitutes with the hope that they would in turn disseminate the disease in the townships elevated conspiratorial fears to a peak. That neither project was carried out, I must be clear on that, failed to prevent representations and discourses from being contaminated by these genocidal ideas, which nourished the news as well as everyday discussions since Didier Fassin's trial ended in 2004, 6 years later, at which time he was triumphantly acquitted by a judge known to be an apartheid nostalgic and continued to practice medicine since he had never been banned from the National Medical Association, a fact that, which confirmed for many the existence of a persisting conspiracy. When I was conducting my field work in Soweto, I often heard black Africans commenting on this story and more generally on plots to exterminate them or simply, as many were sick and had been denied treatment by their government, to let them die, as they would say. Certainly, the South African historical configuration is more exceptional than exemplary. However, it suggests that an inquiry into conspiracy theories can open unexpected black boxes, that of the embodiment of memory in particular, as a possible key of interpretation, but also that it may put to the test some of our epistemological certainties while avoiding, as I've tried to do, the pitfalls of the endless discussion between relativism and positivism. Some truths are scientific, others are historical. Thank you.
Well, Didier will be around for the rest of the morning and welcome discussion of his talk. Now, the next talk is at 9:30 in the Wolfensohn Hall, Stan Leibler, and I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.